Hey everyone! Today I want to talk about the importance of drainage for your container garden. Now, this might not seem like the most exciting topic, but it's incredibly important to ensure that your garden has good drainage so that you don't lose your plants to root rot. So I'm going to talk about what exactly is root rot, signs of it, prevention, different container types that you can have in your garden, and how the container material changes how much water retention the container itself has. So let's get started with why is drainage so important. Now, if you don't have adequate drainage for your plants, you are increasing the chances of root rot. If you haven't heard about root rot before, essentially when your container holds too much water, the roots are going to get mushy and brown and start to die. And if you don't catch it early, which is something I'll talk about in just a bit, it will eventually kill your plant. And I have actually lost more plants to root rot and overwatering than I have to underwatering. So let's talk a little bit about root rot and how you can identify it. So having soil in your garden that's too wet is the exact condition that favors root rot. And essentially, when the soil is so moist, it's too dense to allow adequate airflow into the roots of the plants, which is going to cause them to rot. Now, again, if you don't catch this early on, which is hard to do, this is a condition that will kill your plants. The first symptoms or signs of root rot are actually going to happen below the soil, so that's why it's so hard to catch. Most of the time, you're not going to notice it as a gardener until it starts to affect the leaves of the plant or the parts of your plant that you can see above soil, but by that time, root rot has already done plenty of damage to the roots of the plant itself. So what I'm going to do now is actually take you up close to a plant I currently have, which is suffering from root rot, and I'm still hoping that I can recover it. So we're taking a look right now at my lavender tree, and you can see this one is in a container. It's relatively small compared to other containers in my garden, but essentially what happened is we had 3 to 4 days of extremely heavy rainfall, and that led to root rot not only in this plant but a few others that actually were too far along to recover. So some symptoms and signs of root rot, which is why I wanted to actually take you in close to this plant. So things such as yellowing leaves, which you can see happening on here closer to the inside of the stem. If we actually look really deep inside, you'll actually be able to see that some of the leaves are brown and starting to die. Now again, this is going to happen after the roots have already started to get damaged. So this is a sign that root rot is occurring, but it's one of the later signs in the actual root rot process. So I'm hoping that this one I will still be able to recover. Basically, if you want to know if your plant is kind of too far down the root rot path, if you're going to be able to pull it through, you want to take it out of the container, which I have done. I'm not going to do now because I want to not disturb this plant too much, but you want to take the plant out of the container and look at the roots. If the majority of the roots are soft and brown, that's going to be a sign of root rot. And if you don't see any of the firm and white roots that are typical of a healthy plant, if there's none of those left, it's pretty much a done-for plant, unfortunately. Now this one, I would say about half of the roots when I took it out were that brown, soft material. The other half were the firm white roots. So that's why I'm hoping to give this some time to recover. Essentially what I've been doing is putting it in as much sun as possible, and then if we have any forecasted rain, I'm moving it inside and just hand watering it when it actually looks like it needs water. So once you identify it, again, you want to see how many roots are mushy versus firm. That's going to allow you to know if it's able to be saved. So you want to make sure that you are rehabbing the plant if there are still some of those white roots left, making sure it's not getting too much water. Now, the best way to make sure that your plants aren't going to suffer from root rot is obviously through prevention. So the number one thing is to make sure that you're using containers that have adequate drainage, and I'll go through the specifics of the different container types that are commonly used in the garden. But also you want to make sure you're using soil specifically meant for containers. I mention this in almost any video that I do where I'm showing you how to plant your plants in containers, because if you're using soil from the yard or your garden, it's way too dense and it's going to hold on to too much water. That's going to lead to root rot. So now I'm going to take you up close to the different types of containers I'm going to talk through, and I'll go through the pros and cons of using each type of container and how they'll affect the water retention of your plants. So here's a look at the most common types of containers that you'll probably be using in your container garden. I have my grow bag here. I have a ceramic pot, terracotta, plastic, another glazed ceramic pot, grow bags back there, and then another plastic flower box in the back. At the end, I'll also quickly talk about raised beds as well. These are obviously going to be larger, a little bit different in terms of the smaller containers that you're probably using, but I want to cover all of them and then how using the different container types will impact your plants. So I'm going to start first with the terracotta. So terracotta, which is made out of clay, is actually a great environment for your plants, especially for the plants that are going to prefer either moderate to dry soil. And that's because the clay itself is actually incredibly porous. And that essentially means that the container itself allows moisture to move in and out through the walls of the planter. So the more porous the material is, the more water is going to be able to move in and out. And it also promotes air movement, which is going to be really good for the roots of your plant, helps to avoid root rot. Now, because they are so porous, clay and terracotta pots will release moisture faster. So especially when it's hot outside, you want to make sure that you're watering your plants frequently, just so that they don't dry out. Again, you want to not water too much, you don't want to water too little. I am definitely more towards the tends to overwater. So for me, I know that pots that are very porous or have good drainage are more beneficial just for who I am as a gardener. The terracotta is also a little bit more vulnerable to colder temperatures, again, because the air is moving in and out. So they are prone to breaking in the winter. I will usually move these pots inside, or at least wrap them so that they don't freeze and crack during the winter. Next, moving on to plastic containers. So unlike clay pots or terracotta pots, the plastic is non-porous. So it basically means that it doesn't let in as much moisture or air as more porous materials. So this is going to be I would say, the most water retentive option in your garden. It's going to retain the most water within the container itself. So what this does mean, if you are the type of person who tends to forget to water your plants, or if you travel a lot, then plastic is going to retain the water in the plant a lot longer than something that's terracotta or grow bags, which I'll get to in a second. Now again, I mentioned I tend to overwater, so plastic containers is where I've had the most issue with root rot compared to the other more porous materials. Next are the ceramic glazed pots. So these do have a glaze on them. For me, these are the prettiest pots to have in the garden, so I really like them just for their overall visual appeal. But these kind of fall in between terracotta and plastic, so they have elements of both. They're made out of clay, so the material itself is porous, but the glaze on top of it makes it a lot less porous. So they will hold moisture longer than terracotta, similar to plastic pots, but not quite as long as the plastic pots do. So these, again, are going to be more favorable towards those of us who tend to underwater, or plants who like to remain more moist than dry. So you might, again, be an over or underwaterer, but then you want to think about the plant's needs itself when it comes to picking the right containers. One other thing to consider with these glazed ceramic pots is that a lot of times they'll have those dishes that are kind of attached to the pot itself. This one doesn't. This one just has a drainage hole. But when you have those glazed pots that have that dish that's attached, so you can't actually take the pot off of the dish, you have to tip the pot over in order to remove the water. Make sure you're getting all of that water out, because if you're not, then your plant's going to end up sitting in the water, and again, that's going to increase the overall likeliness of root rot. The next container type I want to talk about are my grow bags. So grow bags are super well aerated, and they have great drainage over more traditional pots, especially plastic and glazed pots. They're made of a very breathable fabric, so although you're not going to see drainage holes in the bottom of these like you would with more traditional containers, the fabric itself allows drainage to happen all around the pot. The aeration of it also allows more air into the roots, again making the root system a lot healthier. I would say in my garden, well actually I know for sure that the grow bags are the most common type of container that I use. It's the container type where my plant has seemed the happiest. So it has great drainage, great aeration, it also allows excess heat to escape from the grow bag. So if it's really hot where you live, instead of something like terracotta or plastic, which may hold the heat a bit more, this is going to let the heat release and not get the soil too hot. So keep that in mind, again, based on the climate where you live. So as you can see, there are a lot of pros and cons for each container type. It's not like there's one container type that's going to be best for every gardener, for every plant, but you do want to make sure that you understand the pros and cons of each so that you can pick your container type based on the needs of you as a gardener and the needs of your plant. But no matter what container type you are using in your garden, you have to make sure that your containers, other than the grow bags, have a drainage hole in them. So whether you're using the clay pots, plastic, ceramic, you need to make sure there is some sort of drainage hole. If not, there's a few different things you can do. But the one thing I want to make sure to say is do not put stones at the bottom of your pot. I know that's something that was kind of going around a few years ago, but that's not actually going to help with drainage. What it's going to do is just increase the water table because you're filling the bottom with rocks. You're going to water them, the water's going to sit here and it's still going to hold that moisture and impact the aeration for your plants. So don't do that. Make sure if you get a container without a drainage hole that you add one to it. So you can do that yourself. I've actually drilled holes in ceramic pots, plastic pots, and then a metal container as well with a drill. Terracotta, because it is more prone to breakage, you might not be comfortable doing that yourself, but if you don't want to use a drill at all, then you can contact your local garden center or nursery and see if they offer that service. I know a lot of plant stores do now because there are a ton of beautiful containers that just don't come with a drainage hole. So I would always recommend, especially for your garden, but even for your houseplants, getting a drainage hole in your containers if you do find one that you like but doesn't already have a hole in it. The last container type I want to go over are raised beds. So my beds are a little bit different than what might be traditional raised beds. I'm on a balcony deck, so my beds don't go into the ground. They're actually elevated off of the deck itself. But even though these are large, you still need to have drainage. So how these are set up is there's not drainage holes. Some containers do have that, but the wooden slats along the bottom of the beds, there's about an inch space between each of them. And then there's a porous lining that just goes over the top to help hold the soil in the bed itself. But that way all of the water can easily drain out, and these beds have really great drainage. I mean, overall, when you're using containers, the larger the container, the more water it's going to hold. You have to water smaller containers much more often, but no matter the size of your container, you need to make sure that there is adequate drainage. And the larger the container, the more drainage holes it's going to require. So that's a look at the different container types that I use, the pros and cons of each. If I had to pick my favorite container type, I think I would have to say grow bags, just because my plants seem to be the happiest in them. They are also incredibly happy in the raised beds, but one benefit of the grow bags is just the mobility. They're light enough that I can pick them up and move them around the garden. Also, my plants seem to be the happiest in grow bags. I actually grew a zucchini plant in this bed last year and a grow bag this year. It did great both times, but it's gotten a lot larger and seems a lot happier and healthier in the grow bag itself. Other benefit of grow bags, they're super cheap. So if you're just starting off, I think grow bags would be the way to go. Definitely if you tend to over instead of underwater your plants, stick with grow bags or terracotta. If you're an underwaterer or you're gone a lot, then you might want to shift more towards the glazed ceramic or the plastic containers, as long as they have a drainage hole. But that is everything for today. I hope you found this video super helpful. I know that thinking of overwatering my plants when I started gardening was never really something that crossed my mind. I was definitely more worried about them drying out completely. But like I said earlier, I've actually lost more plants, both in the garden and in the house, to over instead of underwatering. But that's going to be everything for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!